At 1:43 a.m. on August 9, 1942, off Savo Island in the Solomon Islands, the USS Patterson broadcast a radio alert that shattered the tropical night. Warning, warning, strange ships entering harbor. Within moments, parachute flares deployed by Japanese float planes silhouetted American and Australian warships against the blackness. Searchlights snapped on. Shells began impacting the USS Chicago and HMAS Canberra. Then the torpedoes arrived, invisible, wakeless, and impossibly fast. In 5 minutes, Chicago's bow was gone, blown clean off by a weapon American intelligence had insisted did not exist. Canberra was sinking, torn open by 2 torpedo hits and 24 shell strikes. The slaughter had just commenced. What the Americans did not realize, what their intelligence officers had refused to accept despite pre-war reports, was that Japanese destroyers and cruisers were launching weapons from 12,000 yards out. This was twice the range American captains had been trained to anticipate. The Japanese Type 93 torpedo, later dubbed the Long Lance, was about to teach the United States Navy a severe lesson. Sometimes your adversary isn't just better prepared. Sometimes they are years ahead. This is the account of how American arrogance met Japanese innovation. It details how a single weapon nearly altered the course of the Pacific War, and how it required capturing one of these torpedoes intact for U.S. engineers to concede that Japan had crafted the finest naval torpedo in history. The road to Savo Island started 15 years earlier, in 1927. When a Japanese naval inspector in Britain filed a report that would reshape Japanese naval doctrine. He asserted he had seen HMS Rodney equipped with oxygen-propelled torpedoes. The report was incorrect. Britain had ceased oxygen torpedo development after deadly explosions during tests, but Japanese naval planners did not know that. They perceived an opportunity. Japan's dilemma was strategic and mathematical. The 1922 Washington Naval Treaty had locked Japan into a 5-to-5-3 ratio for capital ships compared to the United States and Britain. In any future Pacific conflict, Japan would have to confront the American battle line as it advanced westward under Plan Orange, the U.S. strategy to relieve the Philippines. Japanese war planners understood their numerically inferior battle line would be annihilated in a decisive fleet action. Unless they could attrit American strength before that final confrontation, torpedoes were the solution. A torpedo fired from a destroyer or cruiser could cripple or sink a battleship valued at 50 times as much. However, existing torpedoes possessed fatal constraints. American and British weapons utilized compressed air to run their engines. Compressed air consists of 21% oxygen and 78% nitrogen. The nitrogen adds nothing to combustion and generates a massive bubble trail, advertising the torpedo's location. Range and speed were constrained by the available oxidizer. In 1928, Rear Admiral Kane Kishimoto and Captain Toshihide Asakuma started developing what would become the Type 93. Their objective was revolutionary: to create a torpedo powered by pure oxygen. Pure oxygen delivers 5 times the oxidizer in the same tank volume, drastically boosting both range and speed. And because pure oxygen combustion yields only carbon dioxide and water vapor, both highly soluble in water, the bubble trail would be almost invisible. The engineering hurdles were immense. Pure oxygen is violently reactive. Mix it with oil or feed it too rapidly into a combustion chamber, and the result is an explosion, not propulsion. Initial tests were catastrophic. Torpedoes detonated upon launch. Sharp bends in oxygen piping compressed and heated the gas until it explosively reacted with microscopic oil traces. Development teams sustained casualties. Captain Kishimoto and his engineers overcame these problems through meticulous precision. They eliminated all sharp bends in oxygen tubing. They scoured tubes with strong alkali solutions to remove every trace of oil. They engineered the engine to ignite using compressed air from a separate tank, only gradually transitioning to pure oxygen once combustion was stable. They manufactured components with a precision that taxed Japanese industrial capabilities to their limits. By 1933, the Type 93 was ready for trials. Its specifications were extraordinary. The torpedo was 29.5 feet long with a 24-inch diameter. It weighed over 6,000 pounds, more than 3 tons. The warhead carried 1,080 pounds of HMAS explosive, roughly equivalent to the impact of a 16-inch naval gun. But the true revolution was its performance. At its high-speed setting, the Type 93 could achieve 49 knots and travel 22,000 yards, over 11 nautical miles. At the slower 36-knot setting, its range extended to an astonishing 44,000 yards, 22 miles. Compare this to the American Mark 15 torpedo, a maximum range of 15,000 yards at 26.5 knots or 6,000 yards at 45 knots. The American weapon carried only 827 pounds of explosive. The Type 93 wasn't merely superior, it operated in an entirely different performance category. Japanese naval officers who observed early tests instantly grasped what they had. The Imperial Japanese Navy classified the Type 93 as its most critical secret weapon. Torpedo officers were forbidden from discussing it with officers not directly involved in torpedo operations. Speed and range settings were omitted from training manuals. Even the fact that the torpedo used oxygen was classified. Training exercises were held under such strict secrecy that ships had to recover every single torpedo fired, sometimes spending hours hunting for one weapon, even in rough seas. This secrecy extended to the torpedoes themselves. On board ships, the oxygen storage system was labeled secondary air tank. Most crewmen had no idea what actually propelled their torpedoes. This created its own issues. As American air superiority increased during the war, Japanese captains under air attack had to choose whether to jettison their Type 93 torpedoes as a safety measure. A single bomb hit near the oxygen tanks could vaporize the ship. But the weapons were so prized that commanders frequently took the risk. By 1935, the Type 93 was operational. By 1938, it armed Japan's heavy cruisers. By 1940, improved versions were being fitted on destroyers. Japanese cruisers and destroyers mounted their torpedo tubes in configurations ranging from twin to quintuple launchers. Some destroyers carried reload torpedoes with rapid reload systems, effectively doubling their available firepower. The Type 92 quadruple mount, common on modern destroyer classes, could launch its torpedoes at 40 feet per second using compressed air silently, offering no warning to enemy ships that they were under attack. Japanese destroyer and cruiser crews trained relentlessly in night torpedo warfare. They drilled in long-range launches, swift reloads, and coordinated mass attacks. By December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor drew America into the war, the Imperial Japanese Navy had the finest torpedo force in the world, armed with a weapon American intelligence refused to believe was real. The Americans had received clues. A U.S. naval attaché submitted a pre-war report claiming he had toured a Japanese destroyer equipped with 24-inch torpedoes, 6 inches larger than standard. The Bureau of Ordnance dismissed the report. Japanese torpedoes could not possibly be larger or better than American weapons. The dismissal was rooted in arrogance, tinged with racism. Made in Japan signified cheap and inferior. American engineers had persuaded themselves that Japanese industry was incapable of producing precision weapons. They were catastrophically mistaken. The first American clash with the Long Lance occurred at the Battle of the Java Sea on February 27, 1942. Dutch Rear Admiral Karel Doorman led a combined American, British, Dutch, and Australian fleet against Japanese invasion convoys. The Japanese heavy cruisers, Haguro and Nachi, operating far beyond what Allied commanders deemed torpedo range, launched spreads of Type 93 torpedoes from 22,000 yards away. The Dutch light cruiser De Ruyter exploded and sank, taking Admiral Doorman with her. The destroyer Courtenaire was hit at approximately 22,000 yards, one of the longest-range torpedo strikes in naval history. The Dutch cruiser Java also went down. The American heavy cruiser Houston and Australian cruiser Perth survived the engagement, only to be sunk the next night at the Battle of Sunda Strait by Type 93 torpedoes from the heavy cruisers Mogami and Mikuma. Allied commanders were mystified. Ships were being struck by torpedoes when no Japanese vessels were in sight. The hits were blamed on submarines working in coordination with surface ships or on mines. The idea that Japanese destroyers and cruisers could fire torpedoes from ranges exceeding 10 miles never entered the minds of Allied naval officers. The shock arrived at Savo Island. Vice Admiral Gunichi Mikawa led a force of 7 cruisers and 1 destroyer speeding down the slot. The passage between the Solomon Islands toward the American landing force at Guadalcanal. American radar-equipped destroyers picked up the Japanese force but misidentified it. By the time USS Patterson broadcast her warning, Mikawa's ships were already launching torpedoes and opening fire at point-blank range. The Southern screening force was hit first. Chicago took a torpedo that blasted off her bow. Canberra absorbed 2 torpedo strikes and 24 shell hits, sinking within 5 minutes. Mikawa's formation then rounded Savo Island and struck the northern force, USS Vincennes, USS Astoria, and USS Quincy. The American cruisers were caught utterly unprepared. Most crews were at a reduced alert level. Officers on Astoria's bridge initially refused to believe they were under attack, ordering their guns to cease fire, thinking they were firing on friendly ships. The Japanese illuminated their targets with searchlights and opened up. Vincennes was struck by at least 2 torpedoes and 74 shells. She capsized and sank within an hour. Quincy took at least 36 shell hits and 2 torpedo strikes. 1 exploded in her fire rooms, another near her interior communications. She rolled over and sank bow first. Astoria absorbed at least 65 shell hits. While her structural damage was not immediately fatal, fires raged uncontrollably. She burned through the night and sank the next morning. In under 1 hour, the Imperial Japanese Navy had annihilated 4 Allied heavy cruisers while sustaining only minor damage. The waters around Savo Island became known as Iron Bottom Sound due to the number of ships resting on the ocean floor. The defeat was the worst blue water naval engagement in United States Navy history. Survivors described events they could not explain. Torpedoes striking from impossible distances with no warning. American captains were trained to zigzag when within torpedo range, but they calculated that range based on American weapons. Japanese destroyers and cruisers were launching from twice that distance, hitting ships whose commanders thought they were safely out of range. Lieutenant Valmore Bordelon, a P-47 Thunderbolt pilot who observed a later battle, described seeing a Japanese destroyer launch torpedoes. There was no visible wake, no bubble trail, nothing to warn the ships they were under attack until the weapons hit. It was like being shot by an invisible gun. The mystery persisted through the Solomon Islands campaign. USS Northampton was sunk at the Battle of Tassafaronga. USS Helena went down at Kula Gulf. The destroyers, USS Strong, Chevalier, Gwynn, and Cooper, were lost. In every case, Type 93 torpedoes struck from ranges American commanders had not thought possible. Naval intelligence kept attributing the strikes to submarines, despite mounting evidence to the contrary. The breakthrough arrived in 1943. During operations on Guadalcanal, a Type 93 torpedo beached itself at Point Cruz. Marines found it partially buried in sand on the reef. The enormous weapon was unlike anything they had ever seen. It dwarfed American torpedoes. The torpedo was carefully recovered and sent to the United States. American naval ordnance experts finally had a chance to study Japan's secret weapon. What they found stunned them. The torpedo's size was immediately obvious, nearly 30 feet long, 24 inches in diameter, 3 tons of precision-engineered weapon. American engineers inspected the propulsion system, noting the sophisticated oxygen feed mechanism and the carefully machined tubing designed to prevent explosions. They tested the gyroscope. a precision instrument transported in special wooden boxes to prevent damage. They analyzed the warhead, over 1,000 pounds of high explosive, enough to break a destroyer in two with one hit. But they still did not grasp the oxidizer system. Initial analysis identified large compressed gas tanks but failed to recognize they held pure oxygen, not air. Bureau of Ordnance estimates of the torpedo's performance remained far below its actual capabilities. It wasn't until February 1944 that American intelligence finally understood what it was facing. Analysis of captured documents and prisoner interrogations uncovered the truth. The Type 93 used pure oxygen. American engineers recalculated its performance based on this new information. The numbers were staggering. A February 1944 survey credited the Type 93 with a range of 22,400 yards at 50 knots and 33,000 yards at 32 knots. A March 1944 report, incorporating more prisoner interrogations, refined those figures: 32,700 to 33,800 yards at 32 knots, and 11,000 yards at 47 knots. The July 1944 edition of the Statistical Summary of the Japanese Navy described the Type 93 as probably the most radical and spectacular development in naval ordnance that has appeared in the Pacific theater. The report credited it with a 1,120-pound warhead and acknowledged its devastating effectiveness. American engineers studying the captured torpedo at the Washington Navy Yard wrote assessments that read like confessions. One engineer's report stated, "The Type 93 represents engineering achievements substantially beyond our own torpedo development. The oxygen propulsion system, while dangerous to handle, provides performance we cannot currently match. The Japanese have solved metallurgical and combustion problems we did not know existed." Another report centered on the tactical implications. American naval doctrine assumed torpedo range parity with potential enemies. This assumption was catastrophically incorrect. Japanese destroyers and cruisers have been engaging our forces from ranges we believed safe. This explains the heavy losses at Savo Island, Tassafaronga, and subsequent engagements. Our casualty figures make sense only when we accept that Japanese torpedoes have twice the effective range of our own weapons. The Bureau of Ordnance faced difficult questions about why it had dismissed pre-war intelligence reports. An internal probe revealed that racism and technological hubris had blinded American analysts to Japanese capabilities. The phrase "made in Japan" had been synonymous with cheap imitation goods during the 1930s. American engineers had assumed Japanese industry couldn't manufacture precision weapons. That assumption had cost over 1,000 American lives at Savo Island alone. The Type 93's sophistication went beyond its propulsion. The gyroscope that kept it on target spun at thousands of RPMs. Powered by the torpedo's own steam generation, it had to maintain stability and direction during runs exceeding 20,000 yards, over 11 miles. The required precision was extraordinary. Post-war analysis demonstrated the gyroscope's construction quality matched or surpassed anything made in the United States. The warhead detonator was remarkably reliable. While American Mark 14 torpedoes suffered from catastrophic detonator failures through 1942 and 1943, submarine commanders reported firing perfect shots at Japanese carriers only to have torpedoes fail to explode. The Type 93's detonator worked consistently. Japanese engineers had tested their torpedoes extensively against actual ship hulks before the war, something American ordnance bureaus had failed to do. The result was a weapon that performed dependably in combat. American submariners could only look on with envy as reports of the Type 93's effectiveness filtered through the fleet. Lieutenant Commander Dudley "Mush" Morton, one of America's most aggressive submarine commanders, returned empty-handed from a patrol in May 1943 due to faulty American torpedoes. On April 9, 1943, Lieutenant Commander John Scott on USS Tunney had 3 perfect shots at the Japanese carriers Junyo, Hiyo, and Taiyo. He fired all 10 torpedo tubes. Not one hit. The Mark 14's problems, running too deep, faulty magnetic detonators, weak contact detonators, were not fully fixed until mid-1944. Meanwhile, the Type 93 worked. Japanese torpedo crews launched spreads from extreme range, confident their weapons would run straight, strike hard, and detonate reliably. The psychological effect on American sailors was profound. Destroyers and cruisers approaching Japanese forces knew they might be under attack from distances where visual contact was impossible. The nearly wakeless torpedoes gave no forewarning. The first sign of danger was often the massive explosion, as over 1,000 pounds of high explosive detonated against the hull. The Type 93 had weaknesses. Its HMAS explosive warhead was more shock-sensitive than torpedoes filled with TNT, meaning it could be set off by nearby explosions. Several Japanese ships were lost when bomb strikes near their torpedo storage triggered secondary explosions. The heavy cruiser Mikuma at Midway suffered catastrophic damage when American dive bombers hit her torpedo storage. The cruiser Chikuma survived the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands because she jettisoned her torpedoes before being hit by bombs. The weapon's size also posed tactical limits. Type 93 torpedoes were too large for submarine tubes. Japan developed a smaller version, the Type 95, for submarine use, but it could not match the surface-launched weapon's performance. The massive torpedoes demanded specialized handling equipment and trained crews. Reload times, though quicker than American or British systems, still constrained sustained combat effectiveness. Most significantly, the Type 93's success hinged on night combat. Japanese tactics stressed closing to torpedo range under darkness, launching massive spreads, and withdrawing before dawn. These tactics were brilliant in the Solomon Islands campaign, where restricted waters and mountainous terrain offered cover. They were less effective in open ocean battles where American radar could detect Japanese forces at long range. As American radar technology advanced through 1943 and 1944, Japan's edge in night combat eroded. American ships could detect Japanese forces, generate firing solutions, and engage with accurate radar-directed gunfire before Japanese torpedo attacks could materialize. The Battle of Cape St. George in November 1943 showed this shift. American destroyers using radar fire control annihilated 3 Japanese destroyers before the Japanese could effectively use their torpedoes. But even as tactical conditions turned against Japan, the Type 93 remained the world's finest torpedo. Post-war analysis confirmed its supremacy. No Allied torpedo matched its blend of range, speed, and warhead size. The American Mark 15, the British 21-inch, and the Soviet 53-38 were all inferior in every measurable respect. American torpedo development accelerated rapidly once engineers grasped what Japan had accomplished. The Mark 16, introduced in 1943, incorporated lessons from analyzing captured Type 93s. American submarines received priority for improved Mark 14 torpedoes with corrected depth mechanisms and redesigned detonators. By mid-1944, American torpedo performance had improved significantly, though it still did not equal Japanese capabilities. The human toll of American technological arrogance was measured in the thousands. 23 Allied warships were sunk by Type 93 strikes, 11 cruisers, 11 destroyers, and 1 fleet aircraft carrier. 13 of these were lost solely to torpedo damage. The others succumbed to combined torpedo and gunfire. Each sinking meant hundreds of sailors lost, young men from Iowa farms, California cities, and towns across Australia and Britain. They died because their commanders thought they were safe from torpedo attack, when in fact they were well within range of weapons their intelligence officers had insisted were non-existent. USS Quincy lost 389 men, USS Vincennes 342, USS Astoria 235, HMAS Canberra 85, USS Northampton 58. The list went on through 1943, each name a ship torn apart by a weapon American engineers had been too arrogant to believe in. The captured Type 93 displayed at the Washington Navy Yard during WWII became an educational tool. Officers and engineers studied it, learning lessons that would shape American naval weapons development for decades. The torpedo remained on display after the war, a reminder of what occurs when technological hubris meets battlefield reality. In 1985, at a reunion of American and Japanese naval veterans in Arizona, a former American destroyer captain approached a Japanese torpedo officer who had served in the Solomons. Through an interpreter, the American asked a question that had troubled him for 40 years. "How did you know where we were?" "Your torpedoes struck from distances we thought were impossible." The Japanese veteran smiled sadly. "We trained for night combat for 10 years before the war. We had excellent night optics, 7-power binoculars that magnified starlight. And we had the Type 93. You called it the Long Lance. We called it our equalizer. It gave us the range to strike from darkness, the speed to reach you before you could evade, and the power to destroy even the toughest cruiser with 2 or 3 hits." The American nodded slowly. "We were told Japanese torpedoes were inferior to ours. Our intelligence was wrong." "Your intelligence was arrogant," the Japanese veteran corrected gently. "You believed made in Japan meant inferior. We spent 15 years proving that assumption wrong. By the time you learned the truth, over 1,000 of your sailors were dead." The conversation finished in silence. Both men grasped the fundamental lesson of the Type 93. In war, underestimating your enemy's capabilities isn't just foolish, it's fatal. The Long Lance's legacy extended far beyond WWII. Soviet engineers who captured Japanese torpedoes in the war's final days reverse-engineered the oxygen propulsion system for their own weapons. Modern Russian torpedoes trace their lineage directly to the Type 93. The United States, despite studying the captured torpedoes extensively, never adopted oxygen propulsion for its own weapons. American engineers deemed the system too hazardous for operational use, demanding training and handling procedures that American doctrine could not support. Instead, American torpedo development concentrated on guidance systems, acoustic homing, and eventually wire-guided and wake homing technologies. Modern American torpedoes are slower and carry smaller warheads than the Type 93, but they compensate with sophisticated targeting systems that the Japanese weapon lacked. The museum at Annapolis displays a Type 93 torpedo outside Dahlgren Hall, flanked by a Type 91 aerial torpedo on the opposite side of the path. Students at the Naval Academy walk past it daily, most oblivious to the weapon's history. A small placard gives the specifications: 29.5 feet long, 24-inch diameter, 3 tons, 1,080-pound warhead, maximum range 22,000 yards at 49 knots. The numbers tell the story, but they fail to convey the shock American engineers felt when they finally realized what Japan had created. The Type 93 serves as a cautionary tale about technological assumptions. American industry in 1942 was vastly superior to Japanese industry in almost every measurable way. American factories produced more steel, more ships, more aircraft, more of everything. But in one specific area, oxygen-powered torpedoes, Japan was years ahead. That narrow superiority, paired with Japanese tactical brilliance in night combat, nearly altered the outcome of the Guadalcanal campaign. If Admiral Mikawa had followed his victory at Savo Island by destroying the American transport ships unloading at Guadalcanal, the entire operation might have failed. The Marines ashore would have been cut off without supplies or reinforcements. The first American offensive in the Pacific could have ended in disaster. Mikawa withdrew, fearing American carrier aircraft that had, in fact, already left the area. His caution saved the American position, but the lesson endured. Technological surprise can be decisive. American sailors at Savo Island confronted an enemy whose weapons surpassed their understanding of the possible. They died not from a lack of courage, but from institutional arrogance that refused to admit Japan could produce superior weapons. The captured Type 93 torpedo forced American naval leadership to face uncomfortable truths. Japanese engineers were not inferior. Japanese industry, while smaller, was capable of remarkable precision, and made in Japan could mean the finest weapon of its type in the world. Those lessons, paid for with over 1,000 American lives at Savo Island and thousands more in later battles, transformed American intelligence doctrine. Never again would the Bureau of Ordnance dismiss reports of enemy weapons capabilities just because they seemed too advanced. Never again would American commanders assume their weapons were superior simply for being American. The Type 93 Long Lance remains the finest torpedo of World War II. It combined revolutionary propulsion, exceptional range and speed, devastating explosive power, and remarkable reliability into a weapon that dominated Pacific naval combat for 2 years. American engineers who examined captured examples finally admitted what their pre-war colleagues had refused to believe. Japan had created something extraordinary. That admission, grudging and painful, marked the moment American technological arrogance met reality. In the wreckage of 4 cruisers on the floor of Iron Bottom Sound, in the careful analysis of the torpedo found at Point Cruz, and in the revised intelligence estimates that finally conceded Japanese superiority, American naval power learned humility. The Long Lance taught the lesson with brutal efficiency. Sometimes your enemy isn't just prepared. Sometimes they're better. And sometimes defeat is the only way to learn that truth.